In a shocking turn of events, Camilla is forced to give up her queen title after Meghan Markle's explosive new memoir exposes racist and classist remarks made by the Duchess of Cornwall. Meghan Markle's tell-all memoir is shaking the very foundations of the British monarchy. Inside, she reveals explosive allegations, complete with dates and witness accounts, accusing Camilla of making racist comments that have sent shockwaves across the globe. As protests erupt and the public's fury grows, King Charles faces a devastating choice: act fast to protect the monarchy's reputation or risk a complete collapse of royal credibility. This is more than a memoir, it's a crisis that could redefine the royal family forever. Stay tuned as we dive into the full story, uncovering the secrets behind the scandal, the witnesses, and the fallout that has forced Camilla to step down from her title as queen. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace was thicker than it had been in years. Signs waved in the air, some hastily scrawled with Sharpie on cardboard, others professionally printed with bold lettering: "Justice for Meghan," and "No place for racism in the monarchy." News vans lined the cobblestone streets, their satellite dishes angled skyward, beaming the chaos to millions watching from their living rooms. Police barricades stretched along the wrought iron gates, holding back a wave of protesters that showed no signs of thinning. The atmosphere was tense, humming with anticipation and disbelief. The British monarchy, an institution that had weathered centuries of wars, political upheavals, and scandals, now stood on the edge of an unprecedented controversy. The whispers had started quietly, nothing more than murmurs in the halls of royal watchers and political analysts. But when Meghan Markle announced her upcoming memoir, everything changed. It began as a simple press release: Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, to publish a revealing memoir. The announcement barely made a ripple at first. Meghan had always been vocal, unafraid to share her truths, regardless of the pushback. But as the release date neared, snippets began to leak, small glimpses of what lay within the pages. One headline in particular shook the monarchy to its core: Camilla's racist remarks exposed. Meghan Markle breaks her silence. The tabloids went into overdrive. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Television pundits debated the validity of Meghan's claims. Some denounced her as vindictive, hell-bent on dismantling the monarchy piece by piece. Others hailed her as a brave whistleblower, unafraid to expose the rot within the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace. Inside the palace, panic set in. Staffers whispered behind closed doors, their voices hushed but hurried. Damage control meetings were scheduled at all hours. Advisors to King Charles scrambled to draft statements that would placate the growing outrage. But even they knew that words would not be enough. Not this time. Meghan's memoir hit the shelves on a crisp Wednesday morning, its cover simple yet bold, her face gazing forward, unflinching. By noon, it had sold out across major retailers. By evening, digital downloads were climbing into the millions. The world was reading, and it was reading fast. The chapters that followed were a firestorm of revelations, each more damning than the last. Meghan recounted her initial meetings with Camilla, her descriptions laced with a sense of foreboding. "I remember feeling the weight of her gaze, as if she were measuring my worth, tallying up my flaws before I'd even spoken," Meghan wrote. It wasn't long before the comments began, subtle at first, then sharper, more cutting. Meghan detailed a string of incidents that painted Camilla in an unforgiving light. Private luncheons where offhand remarks about keeping the bloodline pure were brushed off as jokes. Charity events where Meghan claimed she overheard Camilla whispering about her American upbringing and how it would never be suited for royal expectations. The most damning of all was a private conversation allegedly witnessed by two palace aides. According to Meghan's memoir, Camilla had openly questioned what color the baby would be, followed by a light laugh and a sip of her tea. The backlash was immediate and unrelenting. Hashtags like #DownWithCamilla and #Royal Racism trended worldwide. Political leaders in Commonwealth nations spoke out, demanding accountability from the monarchy. Buckingham Palace, known for its ironclad walls of silence, was forced to release a statement, an unprecedented move that only stoked the flames further. The statement, signed off by King Charles himself, read, "The accusations made are deeply troubling, and the royal family takes such matters very seriously. We will be reviewing these claims thoroughly." But the words fell flat. Protesters outside the palace multiplied. News anchors dissected every line of Meghan's memoir, drawing parallels to Princess Diana's struggles within the same institution. For many, this was history repeating itself, another woman of grace and strength crushed under the weight of royal expectations and unspoken prejudice. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was frigid. Camilla, who had long enjoyed her role as queen consort, found herself increasingly isolated. Key allies distanced themselves, fearing association with the growing scandal. Invitations to high society galas and charity events were quietly rescinded. Even those who once sang her praises now held their tongues. The whispers grew louder. For the first time, there were serious discussions within the palace walls about what needed to be done to restore faith in the monarchy. Sacrifices must be made, one senior advisor reportedly said during a private meeting. The people demand accountability. If we do not act, this could be the end of us. It was King Charles who ultimately made the call. Faced with mounting pressure from both political figures and the public, he scheduled a press conference, a rare occurrence for a monarch known for his measured silence. The announcement was brief but seismic. In a calm, unwavering voice, Charles stated, "In the interest of unity and to demonstrate our commitment to progress, Queen Camilla has graciously agreed to step back from her role as queen consort effective immediately." The crowd outside Buckingham Palace erupted, some in cheers, others in disbelief. Cameramen scrambled to capture the moment as protesters shouted in victory, while others sobbed, clutching signs and waving flags. For Meghan, it was a vindication, proof that the truths she had held onto for so long were finally brought to light. For Camilla, it was exile. Stripped of her title, her name would fade from official documents and palace announcements. Her legacy, once intertwined with the grandeur of royalty, would now be forever marked by scandal. But for the monarchy, the questions had only just begun. If Camilla could fall, who would be next? And more importantly, what other secrets lay hidden behind those palace walls? The aftermath of Meghan Markle's memoir release was nothing short of a political earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the British monarchy. The public, already simmering with discontent over long-standing issues of privilege and power imbalance, found new fuel in Meghan's shocking allegations. The memoir didn't just expose Camilla's alleged racist remarks, it peeled back the curtain on the inner workings of a monarchy seemingly untouched by the social progress sweeping across the world. Within hours of the book's release, social media platforms exploded with hashtags and heated debates. Hashtag Down with Camilla, hashtag Royal Racism, and hashtag Justice for Meghan trended for days, igniting discussions not just in the UK, but across the globe. Commonwealth nations, particularly those with long-standing grievances over colonial histories, saw the revelations as proof of an institution that had refused to modernize. Pundits on major news networks dissected the memoir line by line, speculating on the implications for the royal family and what it might mean for King Charles's reign. Protests erupted outside Buckingham Palace. What started as a handful of people grew into crowds that swelled by the hour. The gates, typically lined with tourists eager for a glimpse of the iconic guards, were now barricaded with police as demonstrators demanded accountability. Signs scrawled with phrases like "End Royal Racism" and "Equality for All" bobbed above the sea of heads, catching the flash of cameras and the attention of journalists. Meghan's revelations had sparked a movement, one that no one, not even the palace, had seen coming. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was tense, shadowed with unease and whispered conversations. Longtime staff members walked the halls with eyes downcast, avoiding questions and sidestepping conversations. Senior aides met behind closed doors, crafting statements that were rewritten, revised, and ultimately scrapped as public fury only grew. King Charles was reportedly livid, his temper flaring behind gilded doors as he demanded answers. How had this been allowed to happen? Who had failed to contain the whispers before they roared into a public outcry? Camilla, once comfortable in her role as queen consort, found herself under a glaring spotlight. Invitations to high-profile charity events and galas were suddenly rescinded, her appearances minimized to avoid attracting further controversy. The press, once careful to tread lightly around the royal family, now hounded her at every turn. Tabloids splashed her image across front pages with headlines screaming for accountability, while talk show hosts debated her moral character with brutal frankness. Her public appearances grew sparse and tightly controlled. When she did appear, the air was different. Gone were the polite smiles and casual waves to onlookers. Her expressions were guarded, eyes often cast downward as she moved through crowds with a retinue of security. Journalists shouted questions as she walked by. Did you really say those things? Will you apologize to Meghan? Her lips remained sealed, her pace unyielding. Inside the palace, a different narrative began to unfold. Senior aides and royal advisors scrambled to craft a response that would calm the storm. Statements were drafted, each carefully worded to address the allegations without outright denial. But the damage was done. The public wanted action, not words. Political figures began to weigh in. Leaders of Commonwealth nations, many of whom had long criticized the monarchy's colonial past, called for accountability. In Parliament, discussions erupted over the role of the monarchy in modern Britain, with some MPs suggesting it was time to reconsider its place in society. The pressure mounted with every passing day. King Charles, known for his calculated demeanor and preference for diplomacy over confrontation, found himself cornered. The advisors who had once whispered solutions and strategies now stared blankly, bereft of answers. His legacy, barely a year old, was crumbling before his eyes. The whispers of reform grew louder, now joined by cries for justice and demands for transparency. This was no longer just about Camilla's alleged remarks. It had evolved into a larger conversation about race, privilege, and the monarchy's role in modern society. In private meetings, advisors began to float ideas that would have once been unthinkable. Perhaps it was time for a gesture, a sacrificial lamb to quiet the masses. The discussions were hushed, steeped in tradition and secrecy, but the implications were clear. If the monarchy was to survive this storm, someone would need to pay the price. Camilla's name was whispered behind closed doors, her role as queen consort questioned by those who once championed her. The queen consort's removal would not be simple. It would require not just a public statement, but a shift in royal protocol that had not been seen in modern history. Some advisors argued it would be the only way to restore faith in the monarchy, to prove that the institution was capable of adapting to the demands of a changing world. Others balked at the idea, citing tradition and loyalty, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of public discontent. As discussions continued, news broke of additional protests planned across major cities: Manchester, Edinburgh, Cardiff, all poised to demand action from the monarchy. Police prepared for the surge, setting up barriers and coordinating with local authorities. The world watched with bated breath, waiting to see how Buckingham Palace would respond. Finally, a decision was reached. King Charles would address the nation, a rare occurrence that signaled the gravity of the situation. Preparations were made in haste. The palace press team worked through the night, crafting a speech that would be both contrite and resolute. But the whispers did not stop. Even on the morning of the announcement, rumors swirled that Camilla had been informed of her fate, stripped of her title, removed from the public eye, all in the name of preserving the monarchy's fragile reputation. When King Charles finally stepped before the cameras, his expression was stoic, his voice steady. In the interest of unity and out of respect for the values we hold dear, Queen Camilla has graciously agreed to step back from her role as queen consort, effective immediately. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of history. We remain committed to addressing these issues head-on and ensuring that our institution reflects the values of equality and respect for all. The announcement was met with a mixture of disbelief and celebration. Outside the palace, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices carrying down the streets of London. News networks cut to live coverage of the protests, capturing the moment in real time. Political leaders hailed the decision as a necessary step toward progress, while royal commentators speculated on what this meant for the future of the monarchy. For Camilla, the days that followed were bleak. She retreated from public life, her presence noticeably absent from royal events and public gatherings. The woman who had once held court alongside King Charles was now relegated to the shadows, her legacy forever tarnished by the allegations that refused to fade. The monarchy, for its part, attempted to rebuild, but the cracks were visible. Meghan's memoir had not just exposed Camilla, it had unearthed deeper issues of race and privilege that could no longer be ignored. Discussions about reform grew louder, and for the first time in generations, the monarchy seemed vulnerable, not from outside threats, but from the weight of its own legacy. This was just the beginning. The memoir's revelations had cracked open a door that would not easily close. For King Charles, it was a battle to preserve not just his reign, but the very institution his family had built for centuries. And for Meghan, it was proof that the truth, once unleashed, could topple even the mightiest of thrones. The storm was far from over, and the world was watching, waiting to see what would come next. The announcement of Camilla stepping down from her role as queen consort sent shockwaves across the globe. While the initial reaction was a blend of disbelief and triumph from Meghan's supporters, the implications of the decision rippled far beyond the palace gates. Analysts on news networks dissected every word of King Charles's speech, replaying the moment his voice quivered ever so slightly as he uttered the words, effective immediately. It was a signal of vulnerability, a crack in the seemingly unbreakable facade of the monarchy. In the days that followed, Buckingham Palace was a fortress of silence. The usual bustle of palace staff moving about with purpose was replaced with hushed whispers and darting glances. Doors that were once left slightly ajar were now shut tightly, conversations behind them muffled and secretive. Senior aides and advisors met behind closed doors, strategizing the monarchy's next steps. Damage control was no longer just a matter of managing public relations. It had become a matter of survival. Camilla's departure from the public eye was swift and absolute. Her belongings were quietly moved from her royal residence into a private estate, far from the glaring eyes of the press. The tabloids speculated wildly about her emotional state, with some claiming she was devastated and others suggesting she had been preparing for this moment for months. The truth, as always with the monarchy, remained elusive. King Charles, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure from political leaders and activists who saw Meghan's memoir as an opportunity to address larger issues within the institution. Questions about the royal family's historical ties to colonialism, its stance on modern racial issues, and its ability to adapt to a rapidly changing society grew louder. Parliament began to see a surge of debates questioning the monarchy's role in contemporary Britain, with some MPs openly calling for reforms that would have been unthinkable just months prior. But the most significant consequence of Meghan's memoir was the rallying of Commonwealth nations. Countries that had long held grudges against the British crown for its colonial past now saw this as a moment of reckoning. Leaders from Jamaica, Barbados, and South Africa spoke out, condemning the racist allegations and demanding not just apologies, but reparations and accountability. For many, Meghan's memoir had become more than just a personal account. It had become a symbol of resistance against a legacy of oppression. Protests erupted not just in London, but in cities across the Commonwealth. Crowds gathered outside embassies and consulates, waving flags and chanting slogans that called for justice and equality. Statues of colonial figures were defaced, some even toppled by protesters demanding that their nations sever ties with the British monarchy. What had begun as a scandal involving a single member of the royal family had evolved into a global movement challenging the very foundations of British imperialism. Inside the palace, the atmosphere grew colder. Meetings became more frequent, with King Charles calling for daily briefings to address the growing unrest. Senior aides presented reports detailing the fallout from Commonwealth nations, summarizing the growing demands for reparations and the threats of secession from the British Commonwealth. The monarchy's influence was waning, and it was clear that mere statements of regret would not suffice. One particularly tense meeting took place in the Crimson Drawing Room, a space traditionally reserved for matters of great significance. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his expression stern, fingers interlaced as he listened intently to his advisors. The usual cordiality of royal meetings had been replaced with a sharp sense of urgency. Documents were slid across the polished mahogany surface, charts outlining the decline in public approval, maps highlighting protest hotspots, and reports detailing the demands of Commonwealth leaders. An advisor, known for his bluntness, finally broke the silence. "Your Majesty, if we do not act swiftly, we risk losing our influence over the Commonwealth entirely. They are demanding change. Real change." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. King Charles, whose reputation had long been one of calm diplomacy, looked up from the reports with an expression of resolve. "And what would you suggest?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with tension. The advisor straightened his papers before responding. "A full acknowledgement of past transgressions, reparations where appropriate, and a commitment to modernizing the monarchy. We must show the world that we are not just reacting to scandal, but leading the way toward progress." A murmur spread across the room, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. For an institution so steeped in tradition, the idea of change, true, systemic change, was not just daunting, it was almost sacrilegious. Yet the reality was clear. The monarchy was teetering on the brink of collapse, and if it did not evolve, it would be left behind. King Charles leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests as he considered the proposition. For a moment, silence filled the room, punctuated only by the distant hum of activity outside the palace walls. Finally, he spoke. "Prepare the documents. I want a draft ready for review by tomorrow morning." The decision marked the beginning of what would be known as the Royal Modernization Initiative, a sweeping set of reforms aimed at addressing the grievances laid bare by Meghan's memoir. The initiative included measures to promote inclusivity, acknowledge historical injustices, and reform the monarchy's ties with the Commonwealth. It was an unprecedented move, one that sparked both praise and outrage across the political spectrum. For Meghan, the news was both validating and bittersweet. Her memoir had accomplished what many thought impossible. It forced the monarchy to confront its own shadows. But the personal toll was significant. Threats and vitriol poured into her public channels, some decrying her as a traitor, others hailing her as a hero. For Harry, the strain was evident. His loyalty to his family now clashed violently with his commitment to his wife and children. The couple, already estranged from royal duties, now found themselves even further isolated from the family that once embraced them. As the initiative took shape, the palace began a series of public appearances designed to mend fences and project unity. King Charles made visits to former colonies, offering statements of regret and promises of partnership moving forward. His speeches were carefully crafted, his demeanor stoic yet conciliatory. But not all were swayed. In Jamaica, protesters lined the streets during his visit, their chants of "End Monarchy Now," a stark reminder that apologies would not heal centuries of injustice. Meanwhile, Camilla remained in the shadows. Her absence from public life was noted in every news broadcast, her silence analyzed and criticized. Speculation grew that she was preparing a public statement, perhaps even a memoir of her own to counter Meghan's accusations. But weeks turned into months, and still, Camilla remained silent. Her reputation, once bolstered by years of carefully curated public appearances, now lay in tatters. The palace, in an attempt to regain control of the narrative, began releasing statements highlighting charitable work and public engagements by other members of the royal family. William and Kate took center stage, their appearances polished and perfectly timed. They were the new faces of the monarchy's future, young, modern, untouched by scandal. Yet even their charm could not fully extinguish the fire Meghan's memoir had started. The Royal Modernization Initiative continued to unfold, each step closely watched by the world. Policies were drafted to promote racial inclusivity within royal charities, educational programs were launched in former colonies, and reparations, though modest, were introduced. It was a beginning, not an end. And while King Charles publicly expressed hope for healing, the reality remained stark. The monarchy had been forever changed. The question that lingered in the minds of millions was simple yet profound. Was it enough? And if not, what more would it take to truly bring about change within the walls of Buckingham Palace? The fallout from Camilla's departure did not stop at the palace gates. For many, it signaled a dramatic shift in the way the monarchy handled accountability, or at least the appearance of it. But while Buckingham Palace issued carefully curated statements of unity and progress, the streets told a very different story. Across London, demonstrations continued with a ferocity that had not been seen since the anti-austerity protests of the early 2010s. Crowds gathered outside Parliament, waving signs that called for justice, equality, and, most shockingly of all, the end of the monarchy. Media outlets, always hungry for controversy, seized the opportunity to amplify the voices of dissent. Interviews with protesters splashed across morning television, their words sharp and unfiltered. The monarchy is outdated. It's a relic of colonialism, a symbol of oppression, shouted one activist, her face obscured by a Guy Fawkes mask. Another held a megaphone, his voice echoing across Westminster Bridge. If the royal family can't clean their own house, maybe it's time we did it for them. The wave of unrest did not stop at the borders of the United Kingdom. Throughout the Commonwealth, Meghan's revelations served as a catalyst for deeper discussions about independence. Jamaica, which had long flirted with the idea of severing its ties with the British Crown, saw its Prime Minister deliver a televised address calling for a national referendum on the matter. In Australia, political leaders reignited debates about transitioning to a republic, citing the scandal as proof that the monarchy was out of step with modern values. In South Africa, a nation with a complex and painful colonial history, the reaction was visceral. Demonstrations erupted outside the British High Commission in Pretoria, where hundreds gathered to demand reparations and acknowledgement of past injustices. Placards reading "Pay for your sins" and "Blood on the Crown" peppered the crowd, their messages blunt and unyielding. Local politicians seized the momentum, pressing for official apologies and financial compensation for the atrocities committed during colonial rule. Meghan's memoir had become more than just a personal account. It had become a symbol of reckoning for generations of marginalized voices. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was somber and strained. Senior aides rushed through corridors with papers clutched tightly to their chests, their conversations hushed and hurried. Crisis meetings became a daily occurrence, with King Charles presiding over long, exhaustive discussions on how best to navigate the growing discontent. Camilla's removal had been meant to stem the tide of outrage, but instead, it had only deepened the cracks in the monarchy's foundation. King Charles, whose temper had grown increasingly short in recent weeks, now found himself isolated and burdened with the weight of decisions that would determine not just the future of his reign, but the very survival of the institution. His advisors, once a source of comfort and counsel, seemed ill-prepared for the level of scrutiny now bearing down on the palace. He would walk the halls alone late at night, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors as he paced, deep in thought. In an attempt to shift public focus, the palace orchestrated a series of high-profile charity events and public appearances by the remaining senior royals. Prince William and Kate Middleton were dispatched to community centers, hospitals, and schools, their smiles broad and unflinching as they posed for photographs and exchanged pleasantries. The intention was clear: to project stability, unity, and a commitment to modern values. But for many, it rang hollow. The damage had been done, and no amount of photo opportunities could paper over the cracks exposed by Meghan's words. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry, now fully disentangled from royal duties, found themselves at the center of global admiration and controversy. Their decision to distance themselves from the monarchy now seemed almost prophetic, a calculated move to escape the rot festering behind palace walls. In the weeks following the release of Meghan's memoir, the couple appeared on major talk shows, participated in panel discussions, and headlined social justice summits. Meghan's voice grew louder, more assertive, her platform swelling with every appearance. She spoke passionately about systemic racism, equality, and the need for transparency within powerful institutions. Harry, always at her side, echoed her sentiments, speaking candidly about the emotional toll the royal life had taken on them both. Their popularity grew in parallel with the monarchy's decline. Polls showed a dramatic shift in public opinion, particularly among younger generations who now viewed Meghan and Harry as symbols of progress and resilience. In stark contrast, support for the monarchy plummeted. Editorials questioned its relevance in the 21st century, while political commentators speculated on whether the British public would tolerate its continued existence in its current form. The calls for reform grew louder. Members of Parliament, emboldened by the growing discontent, began drafting proposals for constitutional changes that would limit the monarchy's influence. Some suggested symbolic gestures, like reducing taxpayer funding for royal events and properties. Others, more radical in their approach, pushed for a complete dissolution of the monarchy altogether. For the first time in modern history, the concept of a Britain without a king or queen was openly debated in political circles. But it was not just the British government feeling the weight of change. The Church of England, long entwined with the monarchy, faced its own crisis of faith. Meghan's memoir had included shocking claims of religious manipulation and moral hypocrisy within royal circles. High-ranking bishops found themselves at the center of scandal as past misdeeds resurfaced in the press, their credibility shattered. Congregations dwindled as trust in the institution eroded, and for the first time in decades, church attendance in major cities fell below critical levels. Faced with mounting pressure from all sides, King Charles was forced into action. In a historic move, he announced the formation of the Royal Transparency Initiative, a project designed to investigate and address issues of inequality and corruption within the monarchy. It was a desperate attempt to restore faith in an institution that many believed had long outlived its relevance. The initiative promised to shine a light on the darker corners of royal affairs, pledging to review centuries-old practices and bring transparency to the monarchy's finances and operations. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some hailed it as a necessary step forward, a sign that the monarchy was finally willing to confront its past and modernize for the future. Others were more skeptical, viewing it as little more than a public relations stunt designed to placate growing unrest. Nevertheless, the initiative moved forward, with King Charles pledging to personally oversee its progress. His appearances grew more frequent, his speeches peppered with words like progress, inclusion, and reconciliation. But behind the scenes, tension simmered. For Camilla, life had become a quiet exile. She retreated to a secluded estate, far from the prying eyes of the press and the whispers of court. Her public appearances ceased entirely, her name slowly fading from the pages of tabloids and the screens of news channels. Friends who once dined with her at lavish palace events now kept their distance, wary of association. She had become, in many ways, a ghost present, but unseen. The question of her legacy hung in the air, unresolved and heavy. Would she be remembered as a symbol of royal privilege brought down by the courage of a single voice? Or would history be kinder, painting her as a victim of circumstance and palace politics? The world watched and waited, but no one knew for sure. For King Charles, the task of preserving the monarchy now rested squarely on his shoulders. He moved forward with calculated precision, issuing statements of unity and pushing for reforms that might stave off the growing discontent. But the shadow of Meghan's revelations lingered, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions could be brought to their knees by the weight of their own secrets. The monarchy had survived centuries of wars, political upheavals, and betrayals, but this time felt different. The questions were louder, the demands more unyielding. And the people, no longer content with whispers and cover-ups, demanded answers. The weeks that followed Camilla's departure from her role as queen consort were marked by a tense and unyielding silence from Buckingham Palace. The crowds that had gathered in protest outside its iron gates were no longer contained to London alone. Across major cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, rallies swelled with momentum, demanding not just accountability for past transgressions but a complete overhaul of the monarchy itself. Chants of justice for Meghan, and down with royal racism, echoed through the streets, accompanied by the relentless clatter of camera shutters and the hum of live broadcasts. In the Caribbean, where the monarchy still held ceremonial sway, the response was even more severe. Barbados, having already declared its independence from the crown the previous year, saw a surge of nationalist pride. Prime Minister Mia Mottley delivered a powerful speech before Parliament, her voice resolute as she called for solidarity among the Commonwealth nations to re-evaluate their ties to the British monarchy. We have long been subjects of an institution that has now proven its detachment from our values. It is time we forge our own path, free from relics of colonial rule. Her words were met with thunderous applause, and similar sentiments began to spread to Jamaica, Belize, and Antigua. Back in the United Kingdom, King Charles found himself under immense pressure to address not only the allegations in Meghan's memoir but the larger conversation it had ignited about the relevance of the monarchy in the modern age. His attempts to pivot public attention through charitable engagements and carefully scripted public appearances were met with lukewarm reception. The press, once deferential to the crown, now wielded Meghan's memoir as a cudgel, probing deeper into the monarchy's inner workings. Long-forgotten controversies were dredged up and splashed across front pages. Old photographs of colonial-era ceremonies, once symbols of British pride, were now presented as evidence of an institution unwilling to face its past. The ripple effects of Meghan's memoir were undeniable. Political analysts took to television screens to debate the monarchy's future, their conversations no longer limited to quiet discussions in academic circles. Now, the question of whether the monarchy should continue was aired out in public view, dissected and analyzed with a fervor that shocked even the most seasoned royal correspondents. Polls began circulating, and the results were staggering. For the first time in British history, a majority of respondents under the age of 35 supported the idea of a republic. Headlines screamed of a generational divide, with younger citizens viewing the monarchy as outdated, while older generations clung to it as a symbol of tradition and national identity. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. King Charles summoned his most trusted advisors for a series of closed-door meetings, each one stretching late into the night. Security was heightened, with additional guards posted at key entrances and exits. It was whispered that the palace feared not just external threats, but internal ones as well. Leaks to the press had become commonplace, with confidential discussions appearing in tabloids almost as quickly as they were spoken. Trust, it seemed, was in short supply. Camilla's isolation was absolute. Stripped of her title, her public appearances ceased entirely. She retreated to a private estate in the countryside, shielded from the relentless eyes of the media. Journalists attempted to breach the perimeter, but were swiftly turned away by armed guards and stern-faced security personnel. Friends and family members who had once populated her social calendar with charity events and private dinners now maintained their distance, wary of the media firestorm that surrounded her. Even longtime allies were hesitant to speak in her defense, afraid of being tainted by association. Rumors swirled that Camilla was preparing her own memoir, a counter to Meghan's explosive claims. Whispers of private meetings with ghostwriters and secret recordings floated through the halls of London's elite literary circles. But nothing materialized. For months, she remained hidden from view, her silence only adding to the speculation. Some speculated she was waiting for the right moment. Others believed she had been silenced by palace decree. The truth remained locked behind the estate's tall iron gates. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry's popularity soared. Their willingness to speak out against the monarchy's alleged injustices endeared them to millions who had long felt disenfranchised by royal tradition. In the United States, their public appearances were met with standing ovations in sold-out venues. Meghan's memoir continued to top bestseller lists, with new translations rolling out in multiple languages to meet international demand. Their names became synonymous with modern activism, their speeches dissected and shared across social media platforms, turning them into global symbols of resistance against institutionalized privilege. The royal family, for its part, struggled to regain control of the narrative. Palace staff worked around the clock to bolster the reputations of William and Kate, whose popularity was seen as the monarchy's last line of defense. The couple made high-profile visits to local charities and hospitals, their appearances polished and purposeful. They were portrayed as the new face of the monarchy, young, progressive, untouched by scandal. But even their charm could not completely shield the crown from the storm that Meghan's memoir had unleashed. The tension reached its peak during a live interview with a former palace aide, who came forward with claims that she had witnessed firsthand the toxic atmosphere Meghan had described in her memoir. Her face, blurred for privacy, appeared on screens across the nation as she recounted moments of tension and exclusion. It was clear that Meghan was never truly accepted, she said, her voice trembling slightly. There were always whispers, always judgment. I don't know if it was because of her background, her race, or simply because she was different. But it was there. The interview sent shockwaves through the nation. Calls for transparency grew louder, with political figures now openly demanding an inquiry into the allegations of racism and discrimination within the palace. Pressure mounted for King Charles to respond with more than just statements. Public trust was eroding, and the monarchy's grip on its image was slipping. The walls of Buckingham Palace, once symbols of power and endurance, now seemed fragile, vulnerable to the winds of change. Finally, in a move that stunned both supporters and critics alike, King Charles announced the formation of the Royal Commission for Equality and Transparency, an independent body tasked with investigating claims of racism and classism within the royal family. The announcement was unprecedented, a clear acknowledgement of the issues that had long simmered beneath the surface. For many, it was seen as a step in the right direction. For others, it was far too little, far too late. The commission's scope was ambitious. It promised to delve into centuries of royal history, unearthing uncomfortable truths and examining the monarchy's role in perpetuating social divides. Activists hailed it as a victory, while royal traditionalists balked at what they perceived as an overreach into the sanctity of the crown. For King Charles, it was a desperate bid to salvage his reign, to prove that the monarchy could evolve and survive in an era increasingly hostile to symbols of privilege and inequality. But as the commission prepared its first round of inquiries, the world held its breath. Would the truth finally come out? Would Meghan's memoir, once dismissed as mere sensationalism, be vindicated by official investigation? And more importantly, would the monarchy withstand the storm that was just beginning to gather strength? The answers remained locked behind palace walls, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And as history had shown time and time again, the truth, once uncovered, had the power to topple even the mightiest of thrones. The announcement of the Royal Commission for Equality and Transparency marked a turning point not just for the monarchy, but for the entire nation. For the first time in modern history, the walls of Buckingham Palace would be penetrated by independent investigators, each armed with the authority to question, examine, and unearth secrets long buried beneath layers of tradition and secrecy. The public reception was mixed. Some hailed it as a necessary step toward progress. while others viewed it as little more than a performative gesture, a desperate attempt to quell rising discontent. Nevertheless, the wheels were set in motion. The Royal Commission, staffed with legal experts, historians, and social justice advocates, began its work with immediate urgency. Their first task was to interview key members of the royal household, past and present. Invitations, though the term was a polite formality, were sent to current palace aides, former staff members, and even a few senior members of the family. The aim was clear: to determine if Meghan's allegations of racism and discrimination were isolated incidents or indicative of a deeper, systemic issue within the royal institution. The commission set up its headquarters not far from Westminster, in a nondescript government building shielded from the prying eyes of the press. Security was tight, with access granted only to those involved in the investigation. Journalists swarmed the surrounding streets, cameras poised for any glimpse of witnesses arriving or departing. Rumors swirled about who would be called to testify, with names like William, Kate, and even King Charles himself floated as potential interviewees. The first round of interviews began quietly. Palace staff arrived under heavy security, ushered through back entrances to avoid the media frenzy that had taken root outside. Many of those called upon were lower-ranking staff, housekeepers, gardeners, drivers, people who had worked in the shadows of royalty but had seen more than they were ever permitted to speak about. One by one, they entered the commission's chambers, seated before a panel of investigators armed with thick files and sharp questions. Leaks to the press were inevitable. Within days, snippets of testimony began to surface. Anonymous sources described a culture of silent hierarchy, where complaints were whispered but never recorded, where discriminatory comments were brushed aside as jokes or misunderstandings. A former housemaid, speaking under the condition of anonymity, described overhearing conversations laced with casual racism and dismissive remarks. "It was just normal," she told the commission, her voice trembling. "No one questioned it. You just learned to keep your head down and carry on." The revelations sparked fresh waves of outrage. News anchors dissected the testimonies with clinical precision, drawing parallels between Meghan's memoir and the lived experiences of palace staff. Public opinion, which had already been fractured, began to sway further. Polls showed a growing disillusionment with the monarchy, particularly among younger generations who now viewed the institution as archaic and unyielding. Amidst the chaos, King Charles found himself increasingly isolated. His closest advisors, once pillars of strength, seemed at a loss for how to navigate the growing scandal. Statements from the palace, traditionally curt and carefully worded, now read as hollow attempts to pacify a public that demanded action, not apologies. He doubled down on public appearances, visiting community centers and hospitals, but the crowds were noticeably smaller, their applause softer and more measured. The commission's work continued, unflinching in its pursuit of the truth. After weeks of interviews with lower-ranking staff, the focus shifted upward. Letters were sent to senior royals, requesting their cooperation in the investigation. The media exploded with speculation. Would William and Kate comply? Would Charles himself sit before the panel and answer questions? The palace, for its part, remained tight-lipped, offering no confirmation or denial of who would be called. Behind the gates of Buckingham Palace, tension simmered. Staffers whispered of long nights and hushed conversations. Meetings were held with senior legal advisors, strategizing the best course of action should a subpoena be issued for a royal appearance. It was uncharted territory. The royal family, historically shielded from legal scrutiny, now faced the real possibility of public interrogation. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry's influence only grew. Their appearances on global stages became platforms for discussions on equality and transparency. In interviews, Meghan spoke candidly about her experiences, her voice steady and unyielding. "The truth always comes out," she remarked during one interview, her eyes fixed on the camera. "No matter how deeply it's buried, it finds its way to the surface." Her words reverberated across social media, sparking renewed support and a resurgence of the #JusticeForMeghan movement. Their popularity did not go unnoticed by the palace. Leaked documents revealed that senior advisors had discussed a strategy to distance the royal family from Meghan and Harry entirely, cutting off any remaining ties in an effort to salvage the monarchy's reputation. The strategy, however, was met with resistance from more moderate voices within the palace, who argued that further alienating the Sussexes would only deepen public mistrust. As the Royal Commission moved forward, new names began to surface, figures long associated with the monarchy who now found themselves pulled into the scandal. One such name was Lord Stamford, a longtime advisor to King Charles and a fixture within the palace for over 3 decades. His reputation for discretion and loyalty was unmatched, but rumors swirled that he had been privy to, if not complicit in, the discriminatory practices outlined in Meghan's memoir. The commission wasted no time. Lord Stamford was summoned for questioning, his appearance a spectacle for the press. Cameras flashed as he arrived, flanked by a team of lawyers and dressed in a charcoal gray suit that did little to soften his stern demeanor. Inside the chamber, he sat across from the panel, his expression unyielding as the questions began. Transcripts from the session, leaked mere hours after his testimony, painted a picture of deflection and evasion. When asked if he had ever witnessed discriminatory behavior within the palace, Stamford responded coolly, "I cannot recall." Pressed further about specific incidents cited in Meghan's memoir, his answers grew more curt. "These are baseless allegations," he said, his tone clipped. "The royal family has always held itself to the highest standards of decorum." But the commission was prepared. They presented written testimonies from former staff members, each detailing moments of discrimination they claimed were witnessed by Stamford himself. His composure faltered, just slightly, but it was enough for the press to seize upon. Headlines splashed across the morning papers declared "Royal Cover-Up Exposed" and "Top Advisor Under Fire for Racism Allegations." The palace issued a statement that same afternoon, carefully worded and devoid of substance. "The allegations are being handled with the utmost seriousness," it read. "We remain committed to the values of equality and respect." But the words rang hollow, mere platitudes against the mounting evidence that the palace had, for years, turned a blind eye to the very issues now threatening its existence. Public pressure mounted for King Charles to take definitive action. Activists called for the removal of those implicated in the commission's findings, demanding transparency and accountability from an institution that had long operated behind closed doors. For many, Camilla's forced departure was no longer enough. They wanted more. They wanted real change. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was tense. Meetings stretched late into the night, voices raised in disagreement over the best path forward. Some argued for further transparency, for cooperation with the commission that might stem the tide of outrage. Others urged resistance, fearful that bending to public pressure would only hasten the monarchy's decline. But the world was watching, and the Royal Commission showed no signs of slowing. With each new revelation, the cracks in the monarchy's foundation grew deeper, its facade of tradition and dignity chipped away by the relentless pursuit of truth. And for King Charles, the question was no longer if change was coming, but if the monarchy would survive it. The Royal Commission for Equality and Transparency had become a force unto itself, wielding authority that even the monarchy struggled to contain. Each passing week brought new testimonies, fresh allegations, and damning revelations that seemed to chip away at the very foundation of Buckingham Palace. For the first time in generations, the institution found itself vulnerable, not from political coups or external threats, but from the consequences of its own history. The media, relentless in its coverage, turned the daily proceedings of the commission into a national spectacle. Front-page headlines chronicled every new witness statement, every leak, every whispered confession from former palace staff. Programs dedicated entire segments to analyzing the implications of what was being uncovered, inviting historians, social activists, and political leaders to debate the monarchy's future. Morning shows interviewed former aides who recounted tales of hierarchy, privilege, and silent complicity. Their stories, once stifled by tradition and loyalty, now poured out in unfiltered streams. One particularly explosive interview featured a former royal protection officer, his identity obscured for security reasons. His voice, though muffled, was steady as he recounted an incident that occurred years prior during a high-profile royal event. According to his testimony, he had witnessed a senior royal make disparaging remarks about Meghan's background, questioning her suitability to represent the crown on the global stage. His account, delivered with chilling precision, corroborated much of what Meghan had described in her memoir. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through the nation, reigniting debates about class, race, and the institution's capacity for reform. The Royal Commission took note. The officer's testimony, combined with accounts from palace staff, former aides, and other witnesses, began to form a mosaic of misconduct and institutional indifference. But the real breakthrough came when the commission successfully subpoenaed internal documents from Buckingham Palace, emails, memos, and confidential reports that spanned decades. The monarchy's long-standing immunity from such scrutiny had finally been breached, and the findings were more revealing than anyone could have anticipated. Buried within the piles of documents were reports that stretched back to the 1990s, highlighting internal concerns about diversity, inclusion, and allegations of mistreatment. One document in particular, dated 2002, outlined recommendations from a senior advisor for the royal family to modernize its approach to race relations and cultural sensitivity. The proposal, marked as confidential, was never acted upon. Another report, stamped with the palace's official seal, detailed an incident involving a charity event where racially insensitive comments were allegedly made by a senior member of the royal family. The document concluded with the note, "Handled internally. No further action required." The public reaction was immediate and unforgiving. News outlets dissected the documents, presenting timelines and connecting dots that painted a picture of deliberate inaction. Protesters once again gathered outside Buckingham Palace, their numbers swelling in solidarity. Signs that read, "No more secrets" and "Equality for all" waved in the brisk London air. Politicians who had long been critical of the monarchy seized the moment, calling for a complete overhaul of its structure. Even members of Parliament began to question the monarchy's role in modern Britain, with some suggesting that its time had come to an end. For King Charles, the weight of the revelations was palpable. His public appearances grew increasingly rare, his speeches shorter and more guarded. Aides close to the monarch whispered of sleepless nights and frantic meetings behind closed doors. The decision to allow the commission access to palace documents had been his own, a move meant to demonstrate transparency and accountability. But the flood of information that followed threatened to drown the very legacy he sought to protect. The commission continued its work undeterred. Its members, empowered by public support and political backing, pressed on with their investigation. Next on their list were the senior royals themselves. Letters were dispatched to Prince William, Kate Middleton, and even King Charles, requesting their cooperation in the ongoing investigation. The palace, ever mindful of tradition, responded with measured diplomacy. In a statement released to the press, it confirmed that senior members of the royal family would comply with the commission's requests, though the nature and extent of their cooperation remained intentionally vague. The press seized upon the announcement with ferocity. Headlines speculated wildly about what would be uncovered. "Will William break his silence?" asked one tabloid, while another declared, "Kate's set to testify. What will she reveal?" The public, captivated by the unfolding drama, waited with bated breath. On the appointed day, the streets outside the commission's headquarters were lined with journalists and onlookers. Police barricades stretched across the pavements, holding back crowds eager for a glimpse of royalty in a position they had never been seen before, under scrutiny. When Prince William arrived, flanked by security and dressed in a dark suit, the cameras flashed incessantly, their clicks echoing off the stone walls of the building. He walked with measured confidence, his expression resolute but unreadable. Inside the chambers, the tension was thick. The room was stark and utilitarian, a far cry from the opulence of Buckingham Palace. William sat before the panel, his hands clasped on the table before him. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for precision, began the questioning. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Your Royal Highness, we appreciate your cooperation today. Our questions will pertain to matters of equality, inclusivity, and the internal culture of Buckingham Palace." William nodded, his jaw set. "I understand." The questions started off general, queries about his role in charitable work, his perspective on modernizing the monarchy. But as the session progressed, the tone shifted. The investigator leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "There have been allegations of discriminatory behavior within the palace, some of which have been linked to senior members of the family. Are you aware of these incidents?" William's expression remained stoic. "I have heard of the allegations, yes," he replied carefully. "And I believe any claims of discrimination should be taken very seriously." "And do you believe they were handled appropriately?" the investigator pressed. There was a pause, a flicker of tension that passed between them. William straightened in his chair. "That is for the commission to decide." I am here to support that process in any way I can. Outside, the media scrambled to capture every moment, every word. News anchors narrated the proceedings with breathless anticipation, dissecting William's every gesture, every inflection. Inside the palace, senior aides monitored the broadcast with rapt attention, noting the public's reaction, tallying the damage, or perhaps the redemption that might follow. The commission's questioning lasted for nearly 3 hours. When William finally emerged from the chambers, his expression was calm, his stride steady. But the implications of his testimony would ripple far beyond the stone walls of the commission's headquarters. The monarchy, long shielded from accountability, was now forced to confront its past, its present, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. For King Charles, the moment was bittersweet. His son had stood before the world and answered questions that, only months before, would have been unthinkable. It was a gesture of transparency, of modernity. But it was also a reminder that the walls that had protected the monarchy for centuries were now crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of public demand for truth and equality. The world watched and waited, knowing that the commission's work was far from over. The investigation had only just begun, and the secrets still buried within Buckingham Palace threatened to upend the very fabric of the British monarchy. The Royal Commission's investigation had reached a turning point. Prince William's testimony, though carefully measured and tightly controlled, had set a precedent that could not be ignored. His appearance before the panel was symbolic, a crack in the fortress-like opacity of Buckingham Palace. If the heir to the throne could be questioned, then the barriers that had once shielded the royal family from accountability were beginning to collapse. Public demand for transparency grew louder, and the commission, emboldened by its progress, announced that more high-profile testimonies were imminent. The announcement sent shockwaves through the political sphere and the media landscape. Speculation erupted over who would be called next. Rumors circulated that Kate Middleton might be brought in to discuss her experiences within the royal family, her role in charitable organizations, and her perspective on the allegations of discrimination raised by Meghan Markle. Some speculated that Princess Anne, known for her frankness and no-nonsense demeanor, would be summoned as well. But it was the whisper of King Charles himself being called to testify that sent the greatest tremors through the nation. The palace, for its part, issued a guarded statement. The royal family remains committed to supporting the Royal Commission for Equality and Transparency. Her Majesty's government and Buckingham Palace are working closely to ensure full cooperation. The words were carefully chosen: cooperation, but not submission; participation, but not culpability. In the days leading up to the next round of testimonies, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace grew heavy with anticipation. Barricades were erected along the Mall, and security was heightened as crowds began to gather, clutching signs and chanting slogans. The press, never one to miss a spectacle, positioned themselves outside the commission's headquarters, cameras at the ready. It was on a gray, rain-soaked morning that Kate Middleton arrived to give her testimony. The scene was surreal, flashes of cameras illuminating her composed expression as she stepped from the black sedan, flanked by security. She wore a navy blue coat, simple and unadorned, her hair tied back in a conservative bun. The press swarmed, shouting questions that went unanswered as she made her way through the throng and into the building. Inside, the chambers were silent save for the soft shuffle of papers and the low murmur of whispers. Kate took her seat before the panel, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The lead investigator, the same sharp-eyed woman who had questioned William, began with the formalities. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for your cooperation today." Kate nodded, her expression calm and resolute. "I'm happy to help." The questioning began slowly, methodically. The panel inquired about her charitable endeavors, her public engagements, and her experience navigating the complexities of royal life. Kate answered with poise, her responses measured and deliberate. But as the session progressed, the questions grew sharper, more pointed. "There have been allegations of discriminatory behavior within the palace," the investigator began, her eyes fixed firmly on Kate's. "We would like to understand your perspective on these claims, given your position and your involvement in public outreach." Kate's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table, but her voice remained steady. "I believe that equality and inclusivity are fundamental values," she replied. "Any claims of discrimination are deeply concerning, and I fully support any efforts to address them. And during your time in the palace, have you personally witnessed or experienced any behaviors that could be considered discriminatory? The investigator pressed. There was a pause, just long enough for the room to tense. Kate's eyes flickered for a moment, the briefest hint of reflection crossing her features before she answered. No, I have not personally witnessed any discriminatory behavior, she replied calmly. But I understand that my experience is not universal, and I fully support those who have raised their voices. The investigator leaned back slightly, her pen tapping softly against the stack of papers before her. Thank you, Your Royal Highness. One final question. For those who have come forward with allegations, do you believe their voices should be heard without prejudice? Kate nodded immediately. Yes, absolutely. Everyone deserves to be heard. The questioning concluded, and Kate rose gracefully from her seat. She exited the chambers with the same composure she had entered with, but outside, the world had already begun to interpret her every word, her every gesture. The press dissected her testimony with brutal precision. Some hailed her as a dignified voice of reason, while others criticized her reluctance to acknowledge the experiences detailed in Meghan's memoir. But the commission was not finished. With Kate's testimony complete, attention now shifted to the looming possibility of King Charles himself being called before the panel. The notion was unprecedented, a reigning monarch facing public scrutiny in such a transparent setting. Constitutional scholars debated the legality and implications of such a move, with some arguing that it would shatter centuries of tradition and others insisting it was the only path forward for true accountability. Buckingham Palace, aware of the mounting pressure, convened a private council of senior advisors to discuss the next steps. The meeting, held in the ornate setting of the White Drawing Room, was attended by high-ranking members of the royal household, key political figures, and legal advisors. Reports later leaked to the press described heated exchanges behind closed doors, with some advocating for full cooperation and others warning of the dangerous precedent it would set. Despite the internal conflict, the palace issued a statement confirming that King Charles would indeed cooperate with the commission if called upon. His Majesty remains committed to transparency and justice and will provide any necessary testimony to support the Royal Commission's efforts, the statement read. The announcement was historic. Never before had a sitting monarch voluntarily agreed to participate in an independent investigation of this scale. The date was set. The world watched as the preparations were made, cameras positioned along the streets, barricades reinforced to contain the expected crowds. Journalists flew in from across the globe, each eager to capture the moment when a king would be held accountable to his own people. It was a spectacle not seen since the days of royal trials centuries ago, a moment when tradition would be forced to bow to the weight of public demand for truth. On the morning of the testimony, the streets of London were a sea of faces. Crowds gathered at dawn, braving the chill and rain to witness history unfold. The procession was somber, almost surreal. A fleet of black cars snaked through the streets, flanked by police escorts and press vans. King Charles sat in the backseat of the lead car, his expression resolute but weary. The years had etched lines of experience and strain into his features, and now, for the first time, he would face the public not as a monarch above reproach, but as a man accountable to the same laws and expectations as those he governed. The doors of the commission's headquarters swung open, and he stepped out onto the pavement, pausing briefly as the flash of cameras illuminated his path. He moved forward with deliberate steps, his back straight, his hands clasped together in a gesture of measured control. The silence from the crowd was deafening. No cheers, no shouts. Only the soft hum of anticipation as the monarch entered the building to face questions that could forever change the course of his reign. Inside, the room was silent as King Charles took his seat. The panel, armed with files and questions sharpened by weeks of preparation, sat across from him, their expressions unyielding. The lead investigator cleared her throat, adjusted her glasses, and leaned forward. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for joining us today. We have many questions, and we appreciate your cooperation." King